I am so happy. This will warm up in a moment, but you can hear me. I'm so happy that as many of you can be here as possible, and shortly I'm sure we'll be joined by a group from Bethel. I know we have a Lakewood Community College group here. We have Augsburg students. We have a high schooler who's done a paper on the project. She's sitting right in the front. And some of my students who really had a course on nothing but Japanese American relocation and redress experience course in our January interim are also here. I am Khin Khin Jensen, for those of you who don't know me, and somehow or other a book came across my desk, as some of you know, which really puzzled me. I am of Asian background and underwent the Japanese war experience, so I was under Japanese military rule. And yet when this book came across, somehow I suppose I reacted in a very strong way, in the sense that I wanted to know more about this. And having had a master's in American history in this country when I came, I was quite curious as to why my professors, and I had a wide range of them from 2 different campuses, why they didn't mention this experience to me, even if it were briefly, so that I could satisfy my own curiosity. And I often ask myself, what are you, Khin Khin, doing talking about this experience when you were almost a prisoner of war yourself, except not behind barbed wire, but a wider boundary where I couldn't move beyond the boundaries of Burma and flee to India. I was under that experience from 41, end of 41 to 45. And yet I relate to this experience because I suppose a sense of justice, a sense of healing, because I met Nisei in Madison, Wisconsin, where I did my PhD, talking to me, inviting me, sharing of their table with me, coming to my wedding, and different acts under different scenes brought about more of a curiosity. And so when Augsburg College, in our January interim, expects professors to come up with some exciting, different courses, I chose to offer a course on the Japanese American experience in 1976. I found that I had to turn away students. There were about 35 in the class, and I said, I'm having several sessions in my home and with meals, and therefore I can't cope with more than that number. And so that was the first course at Augsburg College. Very successful, traumatic for me, for the students, because we learned together, we hurt together, and we had Nisei in our community come to talk to us within a home environment. Well, this last January, I offered the course again, but added redress to it, because within the last 2 years, there has been a whole review of the situation. And last March, I went to Utah, I was the only one from Minnesota, to a conference called an International Conference on Japanese Relocation and Redress. And there I met one of the persons, the young college Nisei in 41, who had challenged the Constitution. And I was very fortunate because I happened to stay in the same hotel as he was. I never dreamed that he would be in Minneapolis. I had hoped I could always bring him, but Hamlin decided to bring him to honor him with what we call a degree of humane letters on Thursday. And he is going to lecture under the very famous Putnam Lecture Series. I have some brochures here for those of you who would like to know more. I also have more of the yellow folders, that are yellow brochures that I sent out, or handouts, about this morning. I preempted my modern China class to do this because I feel that although it was a modern China class, I'm not teaching Japanese Americans this term, it sort of fits in some way. Japan was at war with China. We became involved in war with Asia, particularly Japan is the focus. And many immigrants whose parents came here perhaps long before some other people's parents came suffered because they looked like the enemy. And could this happen again if you look like the enemy? And one of the first things my husband, who's sitting here and teaches at the university, but is an Augsburg graduate, said to me, you know, we must be prepared that in time of war, particularly the Vietnam War, you and I may be separated. You could be at one time put in prison also if Burma and America ever go to war. And facing that reality that I should really consider citizenship, I really became an American citizen in 1959 during the beginning of the escalation of the Vietnam War. But there are punishments to being an American citizen. There are no guaranteed gains also, as Gordon will tell you. Dr. Gordon Hirabayashi was a college student, born in the Washington area, was on campus when the executive order came that he should go with others who were ordered by President Roosevelt's executive order to leave the campus. And like some of you who have maybe a questioning component in your character, question this. After all, he was living, I think, from what I recall, in an international house where he was with other foreign students, and if someone who looked foreign, who wasn't an American citizen, was not being sent, why he? He eventually challenged this, and that will be his story. I'm not going to preempt that. But he went back after the war to get a PhD. He has an earned PhD from the University of Washington. We had the wonderful delight of taking him to dinner last night and learning more about him. But for our purpose today, I thought I would let Gordon share for about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes, his experiences in that challenge process. I would like to open it up as much to the floor as possible because we have in our audience Professor Miles, will you stand? Professor Miles Stenchel from our Political Science Department, who does constitutional law and deals with the Hirabayashi Korematsu case. We have also a professor from Lakewood Community College. Ed, would you stand, please? Ed was from Hawaii originally, was at our military intelligence school at Fort Snelling, and he has been a tremendous help to me in widening my horizons. We have also a sociologist, since Gordon is a sociologist, I'd like to acknowledge Professor, where is he here, back here? We have Gerasimo, Professor Gerasimo, who is a sociologist, as some of you know, teaches racial and minority studies. Thank all of you for coming. I notice guests whom I've sent the information to from the UN Rally Board. Other guests, Gordon has a special guest coming up from Chicago. She's sitting in the audience because she knew him and my students and other students from other colleges. I hope you'll find this exciting. And don't worry about the camera. I told Gordon that I would like to videotape this period because I feel it's so historic. You know, many of us who have stories to tell, and each one of us has a story to tell, we may lose those memories someday. You never know. And I would like this for the Augsburg archives. Thank
you. Good morning. I'm very honored to be here. And I was just thinking when Professor Jensen talked about looking like the enemy and running into problems, what we would have been doing during the Revolutionary War if we followed that same system. We might have gotten our peace earlier. Also, since her class is on China, I was thinking that it would be relevant to mention that while you're learning about China and the patterns and of course certain kinds of changes, rapid changes that are taking place now, which would distinguish the China of today from the past, because of this error that's prone here in North America, you have a Chinese face. They associate you with the Chinese in China. Now, the heritage, this is also true of the Japanese and other countries, where you're a visible minority. They tend to think of you as an inassimilable element and associate you with the heritage country, even the third and fourth generations. So that distinction should be remembered. I think it stems from one of the origins of this myth. I think goes back to maybe 1492. Columbus was supposed to have discovered America. The history writes about that. Even after they talk about his men wading ashore and falling on their knees, kissing the earth and so on, as suntan, lightly clad people gathered around curiously, and they even report that these strangers later brought fresh food and that sort of thing. But it didn't change the story that Columbus discovered America, even though there were some people there. So from that maybe has stemmed the view that this is a white man's country. So a visible minority is always a foreigner. You've heard the old story of a third generation who's never been to the heritage country, talking to an immigrant from Europe who comments, "My, you speak good English." And this is a natural reaction. The other thing I'd like to mention at the outset, in confronting various kinds of experiences, there are always the human and frequently the humorous side of things, if you look for them, that makes confrontation easier to take. And I'd like to tell you a story I heard between George Bernard Shaw, the playwright, and Winston Churchill, the wartime Prime Minister of England. These two people were political protagonists. Shaw was a Fabian socialist, and Churchill, was not. And but they had a grudging and sincere respect for each other, and they were drinking companions, though they maintained their differences. On an opening of a new play that Shaw had written, he enclosed 2 tickets and sent them to Winston Churchill and said, "Here are 2 tickets for the opening of my new show. One for yourself and one for a friend, if you have one." And Churchill wrote back and said, "Thanks, Bernard, for the 2 tickets you sent me. Unfortunately, I have a conflict and I can't make it, but for sure I'll be at your second showing, if there is one." I'd like to just mention a few things at the outset here, and then open it up for questions and comments. As was mentioned, I was a student at the University of Washington at the time of Pearl Harbor. I was living in an international dormitory, and at that time I happened to be the only person of Japanese ancestry. There were some Canadians there, a Filipino. Most of the others were from various places in the United States. It wasn't a big dormitory, my part of it. There were about 14 people. When the curfew order was issued, about 3 months after Pearl Harbor, the order made me subject to it under the kind of wording that said, notice to all persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien. Now, I knew what an alien was. An alien is a non-citizen. I wasn't quite sure what a non-alien was. He's not a non-citizen. And so I took it as a kind of a euphemism for a citizen, if you didn't want to use that word. And throughout the war, I never was referred to as a citizen. I was always a non-alien. I grew up as a minority with two kinds of perspectives, two kinds of realities that I always confronted, but seemingly I was able to cope with them. One was the America, the idealistic America, that's described in terms of the Pledge of Allegiance, the preamble, the Constitution, Bill of Rights, and so on. The other was the day-to-day experience of restrictions, discrimination, prejudice, job openings. We had outstanding engineering students graduating each year from the University of Washington, first rank, third rank, a few always in the top 10. The best they could do was to get a job working as a clerk or a hand with some Japanese importing firm. No professional openings. There were no openings for teaching. If you went to some of the social clubs, the only way you could get in was through the service entrance. This was part of the reality of pre-World War II. And so that was one kind of America that I knew that went along with the other kind, the ideals to which I fully subscribed to. Now, you could say, how could I subscribe to it and continue to subscribe to it in the face of this other America that I was experiencing? And I think a psychologist would tell you, we do this all the time. We have all kinds of conflicts that we hold within us, that if you have to confront them simultaneously, we become schizoid. We cope with most of those because we could face them one at a time, prevent them from converging on our experiences simultaneously. So I face the ideal America in school situations, in other kinds of situations, and keep maintaining those ideals. I face these discriminatory experiences, and I can put this on the shelf while I'm confronting those, so that both kinds of experiences I'm confronting in sequence. Now, when the curfew came, as most of us, we tend to be law-abiding, and so I was following the restrictions, which was basically to be within your residence from 8 p.m. until 6 a.m. And I guess I should say, confine your traveling to within a 5-mile radius of your residence. Anything other than those two restrictions would have to have special permits. So going to the library, going to the coffee shop and so on with the group, always, if I'm not paying attention, somebody among my dorm mates would say, "Hey Gordon, it's 5 minutes to 8, and I'd have to gather up my stuff and dash home. I think I was doing this maybe upwards to a week. And on one of those trips dashing back to the dormitory, which was just off campus, I stopped and asked myself, why am I dashing back? My dorm mates are still there. Why should I have to dash back? And I couldn't find a good answer to that without changing some of the ideals that I had subscribed to, so I turned around and went back, to the initial dismay of some of my dorm mates. Hey, you're going to get into trouble and so on. After I explained that if you guys are here, I don't see why I can't be here unless they tell me something more in the way of restrictions why I shouldn't be there. I didn't think ancestry was the reason. So I stayed, and they continued to associate that allowance with me all the way through, because if one of them reported this, I guess I would have been accosted earlier, but I never was accosted for curfew violation. And since I wasn't one of the current type protester, I wasn't doing it to, agitate the authorities. I just wanted to live like an ordinary American. So the curfew part of it went through without incident during the first month or so. Then followed the exclusion order. About that time, on telephone poles were posted orders in varying in terms of time what district this was being posted. And the restrictions said by such and such deadline, all persons with Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien, must report to such and such pickup place for transfer to the temporary, they called it assembly center. They were very good at euphemisms. And Nazi Germany was pretty good at it too. They had terms like Jewish self-determination camps, youth paradise quarters, and things like that, which they don't use anymore. Nobody uses those terms. It's death camp or concentration camp at best. But we still use words: relocation centers, evacuation, evacuees. Evacuation is a humanitarian term used to move flood victims, earthquake victims, and so on, usually at their request for their benefit, to some more pleasant quarters in an emergency. So this is why they used the word, but it certainly wasn't an appropriate word, and it's not an appropriate word for us to use today. Most of the Japanese still use it because they got to using it without critical attention to the origin of the word, and therefore it's very difficult for them to change, although a few of us have stopped using it when this was brought to our attention in a very critical paper by Raymond Okamura, who researched all the terminologies that the Germans had used compared to all those the Americans had used, and that they have stopped using it over in Germany. We have not stopped. And he felt that if it was just as wrong here, we ought to coordinate our language to associate that fact. In the exclusion situation, I expected that when the university district, which is the last district to be moved in Seattle, when that deadline came, I'd be getting on the bus too. But in the meantime, I had dropped out of school and volunteered for the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker outfit that was organized to assist some of the families and others who needed help in getting ready to move. Many of the families had their fathers picked up and interned right after Pearl Harbor, and where they had little kids and so on. They were having a difficult time, so I had a car loaned and would go around to pick up families where we heard needed attention and would help them pack and drive them over. But on about the third day of doing this, so far as my own plans were concerned, I was struck with a question which I couldn't answer. If I felt as strongly as I did about cooperating with the curfew order, how could I cooperate with this, which in principle was the same, based on ancestry, but where the effects were much worse? I mean, you're not just confined to your home, you're being uprooted from your home. If you had a business, you had to close that up, and then you were going to be detained behind barbed wires. So the whole implication was much worse. How could I go through with that in the face of objecting to curfew? Well, it didn't take me very long to conclude that, well, if I couldn't do that, I couldn't do this. And so for the 10 days or so till my deadline, I knew I wasn't going to be able to go. That was the beginning. Now, I should add a few circumstances that might have made a difference. I'm not sure. I lived in this dormitory half a block from the Japanese Students Club. That was a place where day students all assembled, and there were places for about 40 resident students. This is also right off the campus, and I belonged to that club, but I stayed at the Student Y, the international quarters. Now, the students, Japanese students, would be coming back in a block, bitching about these orders, complaining and so on, but all coming back. And then reinforcing their complaints, but going along with it. I was the only one. I was sticking out like a sore thumb in my center, and so that the difference really stood out. I'm the only one that had to come back. They're all coming back. So I think the notion of protest might have been there in seed, but didn't have a chance to flower as easily as in my situation. There are other circumstances in a longer discussion we might get into, but there were circumstances of that nature, and I don't want to overemphasize some peculiar personal situation or quality that distinguished me from many others who might have done the same thing under different circumstances. Well, okay, now after I made this decision, I wrote a little statement for the FBI. I figured I would meet them someday, and also I had decided that I'd have to turn myself in. The alternative would have been to go underground, if I went underground, I'd have to involve somebody. I'd have to stay somewhere, and somebody'd have to bring me food and water and so on. I didn't want to involve somebody else on a decision of my own, so I decided I would turn myself in. But before I did that, word got around that I was thinking of this. So someone who was then a state senator, Mary Farquharson, approached me and said she and some of her associates were very concerned about the erosion to citizens' rights. And they wanted to do something to stop this hysteria and this rapid erosion, but they found it very difficult to find where they could get a foothold to protest this. And they said, "Are you planning to make a test case?" I agreed that that certainly was a possibility, but I wasn't a law student. I didn't know all of the ramifications, and certainly I didn't have the money to get involved in that kind of plan. So while it was a possibility, I was not planning it right now. She said she and her associates would be very privileged if they could do this sort of thing if I didn't object. And in finding out who her associates were, I found they were people I knew, businessmen in the district, university professors, some of the ministers in the larger churches in the district, a Quaker lawyer, and so on. So that I felt if it's that group, it would not be a group with certain extraneous causes that they would be trying to promote using my case. So we came to an agreement. The initial agreement was to get the local case set up, and then the National American Civil Liberties Union would be taking over. And Mary Farquharson, a member of ACLU, had already done some preliminary work in discussion with the executive secretary in New York. Those things had to be changed. That's written in this book. Peter Irons, a legal historian, contracted to write a book on the 3 constitutional cases, including mine. And in doing the research, he found out not only about our cases, but about other groups that were involved, including the government and the American Civil Liberties Union. And he takes, this is called Justice at War, the story of Japanese-American internment cases, Peter Irons, Oxford Press. He takes various groups to task, including the ACLU, whose raison d'etre for existence is to support injustices to citizens that are taking place. Citizens are human beings being unfairly treated under the law. And so this would be an ideal immediate case, you would think. They refused to take our case at the outset. The people were so supportive of Franklin D. Roosevelt during the New Deal, the recovery period, and the Depression, and they didn't want to do anything to interfere with the war effort. This is a measure of the hysteria that was generated in World War II. It swept even a group like the American Civil Liberties Union to be on the bandwagon. Later they came in at the Supreme Court level, but this was a very eye-opening experience for us at the outset. Two other quick comments, then we'll move to the floor. When I was headed for jail, my Quaker advisor, legal advisor, who did all of the liaison with lawyers for this defense committee that was supporting me, he said, when you get to jail, you take care of yourself, because while those guys may be convicts, they might be patriotic too, and they might take offense at what you're doing. I'd never, I was a sociology undergraduate at the time, but I never was in a class that took a field trip to jail, so I never even seen a jail until I walked into one. And I was on the alert for some unfriendly action. Nothing like that occurred, and in due course, since I was there long enough, I became mayor of my federal tank and was running the business there. And one other sideline of that part of the experience, when my trial came up finally, about 5 months after my arrest, I was arrested officially the day after the university district moved. After they were all gone, the Quaker advisor and I went to the FBI office the next morning. And then that was in May. Then in October, towards the end of October, we had our trial. And I was mayor of my tank. It was late at night when the night sergeant came in and tapped on my bars there and said, "Say, I got somebody here, what do I do with him?" See, whenever a new prisoner came, it was up to me to get him situated inside. And so I was just pulling his leg. I said, well, why don't you bring him during the day so we could do this in the daylight instead of middle of the night? And he says, well, I got to bring him when they come. And I looked out through the shadows. This great big sergeant, a guy about half his size, standing there in the shadows. And I looked a little more carefully, and it was my father. What the government had done was to subpoena him from the Tule Lake concentration camp to come up to testify. What they wanted to do, not that I was denying it, I was saying I'm an American citizen of Japanese ancestry, but that didn't mean that I'd have to move. I mean, according to the Constitution, there was no grounds for offense. They wanted to make sure that the Japanese ancestry part was solidly legally established, so they brought the parents up to demonstrate they were Japanese and that I was their offspring. So they brought him up. I didn't know about this. So I looked out and I said, "Hey, that's Dad." Well, I had an empty bunk in my section, so I said, put him in there. And so they opened the bar doors, and we had about a 10-day visit together. And he told me that my mother was there too, somewhere in the city, women's tank. And that was an unexpected experience, and in principle it's terrible for the government to bring a witness in and then dump him in jail. Actually, when my backers heard of this, they told me that they offered their homes as a place where they could stay for the trial, even if they weren't their witness. And when the government hesitated, they said, well, deputize us, then we'd be official guardians. Well, they were still hesitant, and they stuck him in jail. Now, on the personal side, it turned out to be very beneficial for their experience, because they had never seen a jail before either. And my mother's only experience with jails, the image she had was when she read The Count of Monte Cristo, on the dungeons and so on, and she had been thinking about the kind of environment I might be in, hung by my thumb and that sort of thing. So this experience removed that kind of fear. It was kind of a crummy place, cockroachy and so on, but it wasn't that type of a torture chamber. And in my mother's experience, the men were separated according to whether they had violated a local ordinance or a state law or a federal. We were in separate sections, and of course we federals looked down on the other petty ones. In the women's case, they just had one tank and they put everybody in there. And when she walked in, she said everybody was talking, occupied in little clusters, so she wandered around and stopped by an old broken down piano, and she happened to play, so she started plunking away and started playing, and women began to gather around and sing folk songs and so on. She became embarrassed and said, well, somebody else play. That's all she knows. Well, they forced her to play more. She said, nobody else here plays. And through that kind of opening, she's fairly an outgoing person, so they became friendly and conversant. And about 5 days later, when our trial was set, all of us were waiting there for the women's quarters to open up and she would come out. Well, she came out, we were all surprised because she came out looking like a queen. She said about 6 of the women, they were petty thieves, streetwalkers, various types of people, but with experience in fixing themselves. So she had about 6 people working on her hair, fingers, face, and so on. And she was a farmer's wife, so this was the first beauty parlor experience she had. And she came out it's too bad she only went to court with that. But after that experience, there was no more concern of the physical part of the treatment. And so that was the one positive part. As I mentioned before, there are always positive things you could look at. Doesn't justify it, but it makes adjustment easier. The last comment I want to make is we had a whole day's trial. At one point, when they had my father up on the stands, he speaks English, and he was understanding what's going on, but he'd never been in court before. He'd never been in a public kind of meeting like that, so he was very hesitant about responding, and my lawyer, without checking with me, popped up and said, Your Honor, I think we should get an interpreter for Mr. Hirabayashi. And the judge says, oh, that's a good idea. Is anybody in here translate for him? Well, I knew it wasn't necessary, but we waited, and nobody happened to be there or who came forward. So after a bit of silence, I said, well, I could translate for him if it's legal. And the judge said, okay. And so I went through a funny kind of experience, knowing he knew what the question was, and I'd have to do it in my poor Japanese. Questions like, where were you born? And do you have any offspring? Is there any of your offspring in this room? Where? I'm just translating the questions, and he sort of would smile a little and point his finger at me. And so that established my ancestry legally, so far as the court was concerned. But the point I wanted to mention was, see, my lawyer spent all the time setting the foundation for a Supreme Court hearing on the constitutionality of this. The lower court was not interested in that, the federal court. And the instruction to the jury indicates that. The judge said to the jury, you can forget all that argument about the Constitution and so on that the defense made. He says, that's not your concern. All you're supposed to be concerned with are these questions. The Western Defense Command had certain regulations regarding curfew and regarding exclusion order, and he read these to the jury again, and he said, you are to determine whether he is of Japanese ancestry. If he is, he's subject to these orders, and you're to determine whether he followed those orders. If not, you bring in a verdict of guilty. Well, that's cut and dried. He didn't offer any legitimacy for questioning the orders of the Western Defense Command to an American citizen, anything like that. So in effect, our team felt that the judge really should have been disqualified for denying me trial. I didn't even have a trial. He just didn't allow those basic questions to be raised. We anticipated this, so it was in the record that went up to the Supreme Court. And at the time of going up in 1942, October, we felt that it would take about 2 years before it would get on the docket of the Supreme Court. And by that time, maybe the hysteria would be down a little, and a chance for a more objective legal review would be present, and we could have a overturning of this lower court decision. The records indicate that it went up there in 7 months at the height of the hysteria. And as Peter Irons finds out, with government misconduct in suppressing information from the justices, and the lower court decision was upheld. So I had the sentence to go through, and the aim of having my day in court at the Supreme Court did not result the way we anticipated. So I'll just stop at that point and then turn it over to
Thank you, Gordon. Why don't you come up here, because we'll just open it up to the floor. I think what you've heard now is a personal record, what you don't really read too much in the books. I have here a number of books, and particularly the one, Justice at War. Peter Irons, as Gordon mentioned, is a young lawyer. He's a professor of political science in the California system, and really has done some exciting things. Shortly after 12, I have the CBS videotape in which Gordon appeared, where those of you who can stay and see the 60 Minutes portion of how justice may one day come to play in both Gordon and some of the other cases. Korematsu case has already been in California, now won. But some of you have some special interest. Gordon is ready to react to, respond to some questions. So we'll open it up, and Gordon, why don't you feel them, and we'll see how it comes up. Anyone?
How long were you held in jail?
Well, over a 3.5 year period, from May of 42 until the last time I came out from McNeil Federal Penitentiary in September of 1945. That's a 3.5 year period. I was in and out for a total of about 2 years. But none of the stretches were longer than 9 months at a time. You people don't realize it, but that makes a big difference in my own adjustment. Some of the people that I know who were in for 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, they have a very difficult time overcoming psychologically some of the bitterness and the negative perspective you get in prison in terms of adjusting back to normal civilian life. 9 months is short enough that the recovery is much faster, and I may have a bunch of effects on me, but it hasn't significantly bothered me anyway.
I was just hearing this morning about some kind of strange sudden death syndrome that has been permeating the Hmong community, and I wondered if there was any comparable experience among the Mipe in the concentration camps.
There are questions raised now among my compatriots, the second generation Nisei, who are in their 50s, 60s, and some in the 70s. And they're saying that the death rate of those beyond 50 is higher than the average, with heart attacks and things of that nature. And we need more research on this to establish that fact and to associate that event, if it is a fact, with causal antecedents. And that has not been made, but there's some hypotheses that it may be due to some of the tensions created and the after effects of that, but that has to be researched further.
May I say something?
Yeah. This is Betty Hasegawa from Chicago, who was one of my high school classmates.
I was in the concentration camp, and I was a nurse there. And the incidents, I was one of the witnesses for the Redress program in Chicago. And I talked about the mental illness and the suicides and the terrible things that happened in camp to us. And that was, why I witnessed for the government, I mean, not for the government, for the redress. And there is really, like for instance, my husband was completely wiped out. I mean, after the war, I think he never really realized or came back up. And I just want to tell you one incident. I was pregnant with my third child, and we were under this 5-mile curfew. Well, we lived in the country, and we were farmers, and we couldn't even go to buy a loaf of bread without going 5 miles. So I went into labor, and I had to go somewhere to be delivered, and I called Dr. Allen, and he said, well, you just keep coming. I'll whatever it is, I will vouch for you. And so we drove, and I finally got to the Allen Clinic, and he delivered me my son, and we named him Allen. But he put a big quarantine sign on the door, and he delivered me and hid me in his hospital.
Any questions?
There's a book coming out, I don't know what the name is, it's not out, it's published now, but it's not out for circulation yet, written by the research director of the Redress, Japanese-American Redress, John Tateishi, enclosing many of the testimonial statements that came out in the Redress hearings, cases like this, of the experiences they went through. Yes?
What was the actual charge that it stated as?
Me?
Yes.
The actual charge was violation of curfew regulations as issued by the Western Defense Command and violation of the Exclusion Order requirements on the grounds that I was subject to it through my ancestry, the way it was defined. The the Western Defense Command was delegated to issue these things under a presidential order, Executive Order 9066. I mean, I happen to know that one because we've looked into that. And under the War Powers Act of the President, he was given all kinds of powers to prosecute the war. And under that power, he delegated to military commanders through the Secretary of War whatever was necessary for the national defense. Now, this book indicates and other evidences indicate that national defense wasn't in question. On the West Coast, there was no martial law. They didn't feel the conditions warranted that kind of suspension of civilian rule. So they would need to justify this drastic action. The information that was suppressed from the Supreme Court justices by the government at the time of the trials were things that indicated from the FBI, who stated that right after Pearl Harbor they had picked up all the community leaders. Whether they're guilty or not, they picked up all the community leaders as potential dangerous aliens, and they had surveillance on other potentials. So they didn't feel that there was any need to pick up women and children and ordinary workers. And so something like a mass exclusion was unwarranted. Federal Communications Commission had checked out 275 or so complaints that came in about signals going out from presumably Japanese residents in the West Coast out to the ships at sea. Well, none of them indicated they were going out from mainland to the sea. Some of them were from Japan to the ships and from ship to ship and so on. And these clarifications were on the general's desk when he issued these orders. He was under strong political pressure from movements that not only became alive right at wartime, but who were agitating since the turn of the century to get rid of these Asian hordes, yellow pearl, they call them, pearl. P-E-R-I-L, not P-E-A-R-L. And so war came along more as an excuse to do a long-standing objective rather than the reason for this action. Yes?
What was the total number of Japanese or Japanese Americans who resisted as you did?
Frontal resistance, at the outset, that was one of my surprise. I thought when the smoke cleared, there would be maybe 100 or so, and I would join that big mass in a mass court case. There wasn't any others who took this frontal thing, though Korematsu defied it in a different way. He had a Caucasian girlfriend, and he wanted to stay behind, so he followed one of the ads he noticed about a nose job and eyelids and so on, and tried to become like a Southeast Asian or something.
Chinese. That comes out in the CBS video that I'll show you.
And after he did this, everybody said, "Oh, hi, Fred." They seemed to see. It didn't make too much difference, I guess. But he used to get his cigarettes at a particular store, and he continued to do that. And on one of those trips, he was picked up. And he was in jail until Northern California Civil Liberties Union went to visit him, and then since he had no other plans, they agreed to take his case. That's how that went up. And earlier, there's a third case, Yasui in Portland, and that was just on the curfew part. He, being a young lawyer, had decided to test the thing. So he had a legalistic notion. And he tells me that he walked around at night, even tapping the policeman, saying, "I'm out, arrest me." And the guys would say, go on home, you're supposed to be home." He said he had an awful time getting arrested so he could begin his case. eventually he did, and the essence of his situation is that he had worked earlier for a brief period for the Japanese consulate in Chicago. And on that basis, the judge at his trial said, well, since you worked for a foreign country, you have lost your citizenship, so you're like an alien. And as an alien, you're subject to this thing. He indicated that if he were not, he might have, I wished I had him for a judge, because implications were that if he were a citizen, he might have made a different decision. I don't know that, but it sounds that way. He said, since you're an alien, you have to, no question, you're subject to it, and you violated it, so you're guilty. And when it got to the Supreme Court, his case was attached to mine. So after they turned me down, they said, well, since Hirabayashi's decision was this, you're guilty too. So the three of us are the ones that are up on this 40-year revival of the case. And I should comment just briefly on this. There is a rarely used legal device called writ of error coram nobis. And when there is misconduct, evidence of misconduct, you could appeal even after the 7-year statute of limitation in petitioning for a rehearing. It's not an open trial. You don't get a retrial on the whole case. But you could argue what the restrictions, the misconduct was, and the implications of the misconduct. You're limited to that, but you could raise it, and that's what we're doing now. Korematsu case had its hearing in November, Yasui in January, mine scheduled for May 4. And on that limited basis, coram nobis.
That was a question, Jerry?
Yes. Professor, what was the American government's strategy in the Hawaiian Islands when you had such a large proportion of people with Asian ancestry?
Yeah, the counterpart to the description I made about the West Coast condition not being under martial law and so on, Hawaii had been attacked, of course, after Pearl Harbor, and immediately was under martial law. Civilian regulations were suspended. 1/3 of the population, at least the largest single minority group or ethnic group was Japanese ancestry. Under those circumstances, you think Hawaii would be the one that will be moved rather than the West Coast, but nothing was done there in the way of mass movement. There were individuals that were picked up, just as there were individual German and Italian aliens, but nothing in the way of mass. There are a couple of reasons for this. One was the logistical problem of moving 200,000-300,000 people. And where would they move them to? The mainland. Well, that's not what the mainland agitators wanted. Secondly, well, I guess I gave the reason. The mainland people weren't interested in having more Japanese come in. They were trying to get rid of them. And secondly, they had this martial law, but the second reason was economic. They had most of the service and maintenance jobs on the island, and moving the Japanese would have collapsed the economy there and the civilian operation. And that was too important a strategic military post for the Americans to risk. So they weren't interested for that reason either.
I'd like to mention that Bud, Professor Nakasone, is from Hawaii.
Yeah.
And would you like to make a comment, Bud, to add to Gordon's?
Well, it is true that they had thought about moving the Japanese Americans and all the other Japanese Issei back to the mainland. There was also another element there whereby another thought, and that was to place them all on the what we call the leper island of Molokai. Well, you can imagine if you had as close to 180,000 people there on one island, what a tragic difficult that would be for the military authorities, and having martial law over there, pretty much as they say, full control over the population. We didn't have civil rights for a long period until the martial law was taken away.
You were a territory at that time,
You
too,
were a
not a
territory
state.
at that time, that's true. So, while I'm standing, I might want to ask Professor Hirabayashi a question there, since most Japanese are inclined to be law-abiding. We always say that during World War II, we were 110%, if not more, in support of the government. I'm wondering, when you first contemplated this idea of going against the constitutional difficulties you were facing, what were your thoughts of your parents, who were generally in line with the Japanese thought that we should follow the law and be orderly and all that? And beyond that, what about the Japanese American Citizens League? Did they give you support on this idea of challenging the government?
Those are very significant questions, because the Japanese, all through from the turn of the century to World War II, were living under a period quite different from now. They didn't have human rights laws, fair accommodation, laws that hotels and restaurants could refuse service for whatever reason. It's illegal now, but it wasn't then. And the protest era of the 1960s and so on, for the population in general, had not existed at that point. So in general, the population was fairly quiet on protest-type activities, and the Japanese were even more so. See, I was told when I was growing up, injustice is not the priority thing that you should be concerned about. It's survival. Even if you were to win an injustice suit, you could get it in the neck one way or the other, or your family would be intimidated some way, so that that's not the important thing. And the community pressure was heavy on that. They had all kinds of slogans like to augment this perspective. In Japanese, there's one that says "Deru kugi wa utareru," which means the nail that sticks out is the one that gets hit. So don't rock the boat, don't stick out in attention, bend with the wind, and so on. The conformity emphasis was very strong. So in answer to your questions, my parents, I don't think the way I am independent of my parents. My parents were kind of oddballs too, I guess. They were Christians, but belonged to a kind of an independent offshoot, refused to join a denomination. And somewhat like the Quakers, although they didn't know anything about the fact that such a group as the Quakers existed, but in retrospect they look pretty similar. So their appeal to me was they agree with my viewpoint. It's wrong and all that, but we don't want to get separated now, because at that time they didn't know where they were going. They're going to be uprooted. They were sent down to near Fresno, but that was just known just shortly before they left. They didn't know how long or under what conditions and what would happen after that. And more than that, they were concerned about what would happen to me if I refused, and if I weren't shot or something, where would I be? And the family would never get together. That was my mother's concern. She used every argument, and she used tears and everything. I tried hard to accommodate her, but I finally concluded that I wouldn't be very good being with her with no, having given up my self-respect. If I could convince myself without losing my self-respect, I would have gone along, but I couldn't do that. And so I said, I can't do it. And I felt badly about it until about 2 months later, she wrote me a letter. You know, the people in camp behind barbed wires were very frustrated, and they turned against this group, the Japanese American Citizens Group, who had decided to take a stand. And this is the amazing thing, you know, human beings could do all sorts of things and rationalize all sorts of things. They said that they're interested in demonstrating their loyalty to their country, and as an evidence of this loyalty, they're going to cooperate with this order that deprives them of their citizens' rights to show how loyal they are. So they went along with the, they didn't protest this. In fact, they discouraged any kind of objections as backlash. Everybody's going to suffer if you object, so let's do this, let's cooperate and do it smoothly. And they did it. They did cooperate. On my part, I never consulted them. I knew their viewpoint. And so by the time they found out what my viewpoints were, they were behind barbed wires. And so I had no relation with them, and I guess they would have dissociated themselves anyway. And the evidence I have for making that judgment is when the Northern California group picked up the Korematsu case a little later, and that was going up to the Supreme Court. The lawyer, Wayne Collins for Korematsu, contacted the Japanese American Citizens League to have them join as a cooperative group jointly to fight that case. This is a year after the immediate part of the uprooting, so it seems like in retrospect it wouldn't have been so dangerous, but the attitude then was, we don't want to do anything to obstruct or to be inferred as obstructing the war effort and getting their loyalty questioned, so they said they cannot. And this Wayne Collins, a kind of a emotional, hot-tempered person, he went down to his grave with the determination never to ever speak to that group again, and he did that. He was very bitter against this group. Well, in my case, like I mentioned at the outset about looking for the human and the humorous side of things, another thing I tried to do, and it's a self-preservation technique, I tried to distinguish between issues and principles that I was for or against from persons who were by circumstance or elected to prosecute those principles or issues in defending the government or something, and so they'd be having to arrest me or be the judge against me or whatever. My personal regard for them was with as much respect as their behavior would require. While I would be completely opposed to what they were doing, I didn't let that affect my personal regard, so that I felt in order to be embittered and be antagonistic and personally involved, I'd have to get down to the gutter or wherever that kind of emotions would have to be demonstrated. So as a self-preservation technique, I just didn't want to do that. And so I didn't get personally involved with the JACL, and when they did come and write a friend of the court amicus curiae brief, I welcomed it. And I happen to be a conscientious objector, and I was during the war. So my position is different from, say, the Nisei veterans. And for that, some of the Nisei vets may look at me with suspicion, but the author of the person who wrote the book, Go for Broke, it's a very fancy picture book on the record of the Nisei vets that came out a couple years ago. They're producing a videotape now, video program, about the goals and effort of the Nisei vets in sacrificing their lives, being, I guess, the most decorated group, the largest number of Purple Hearts and so on of any unit. They had a good record because they claimed that they were fighting two wars, one against a military enemy and one fighting for their principles at home. And on that ground, the editor of this book asked me to come and join the videotape part by participating in the constitutional fight. And he said, that's the other side of the coin. That's why we were over there sacrificing the things, so we're fighting the same fight. I said, well, I feel the same too. So my methods were different than the vets, but I respected you people for what you were doing. And if you know that, and don't mind that I was a conscientious objector, I'm glad to join you on that constitutional fight. And so I spent one whole day being interviewed as part of the tape that they're going to edit. I haven't seen it, so I don't know how it came out, but that's the other side of it in terms of the kinds of battles that people are making. I'm willing to join all types of people for causes whose aims are similar to mine.
Gordon just mentioned the lawyer Wayne Collins. I have a book here. His picture is here if any of you want to see it. This book that I have was dedicated to him. It's called Years of Infamy by a very good author, Mishi Wedgland, and she's gone to the National Archives just as I've been there 10 days ago, really digging up stuff. And a comment by another professor here, Jill Frass is a professor in the political science department. Many didn't challenge like Gordon did in a constitutional way, but they challenged the system of being in the camps at Tule Lake, especially, and this book has some horrible pictures of people behind the bars that has never come out. So this is very good for those of you who are interested in it. There were some other hands here earlier, some students.
In May, I'm doing a lot of talking. You do mind?
Go ahead, that's part of this business here.
I knew Gordon's mother and his father and everybody. So, but anyway,
Don't tell him too much.
this year in May, I went to the National Archives and I demanded all of my FBI record, and I got it. And I made a copy for each one of my sons so that they will have their history. Because my number 4 son, who is now an attorney, was born in the camp.
It's wonderful to have you here because I didn't realize you would be here. But this is what, what science history is all about. It's living history. And we need to see the persons involved in what we read about. This is the most exciting thing for me, to react in Minneapolis with people who I'm available to react to, like we have some professors here. Other questions?
I was, right after I got my PhD, I wanted to have international experience, go abroad. My only wartime going abroad, sort of, in quotes, was on a boat ride from Stilcombe near Tacoma to McNeil Island Penitentiary, which was an island. So when I got out, getting ready for my degree, I was negotiating, looking around where I could go, because I had to teach where I could teach in English. That's the only language of instruction that I could professionally do. And American University of Beirut was one of those few that became available. They were interested, so we worked out about a 2-year ahead contract. And I was going to finish my degree by then. Something happened to their personnel problem, and they asked me to come 1 year earlier. And I had some kind of a foresight. I guess part of it was I had lost about 4 years of education time during the war, so I didn't want to delay it again by leaving before my PhD, halfway around the world. In those days, the communication wasn't all as fast as now. So I said, no, I can't go until I finish. And they kept writing back. They were desperate. They wanted me to advance it a year. So some kind of flash came, and I said, what about mid-year, second semester? Maybe if I really worked hard, I could finish by then. And that was agreed to, and that's what happened. I went there January of '52 instead of fall of '51. And while I was over there, trying to, in the developing areas, explain the model of American democracy and so on, so at some point the occasion would come up where they would be asking, what were you doing during the war and so on, and they said, oh, how come you were in prison? And I thought that was a democracy and so on. It was not easy to explain, you know, to those people who had certain kinds of idealistic picture about democratic America and so on. And the way that I could explain it with some positive perspective was, well, there are a lot of things that happen in a democracy. They don't always happen at once. And something is done, and later, one good thing about democracy is corrections could come in. And I expect someday that there will be a correction to this. And I don't know how much they accepted that, but this Coram Nobis case is a kind of a step in that direction.
Any other questions? Yes, right.
I guess one of my concerns, although it's probably hard to answer, is if you think that anything like this could ever happen again in the future?
It could happen again. It's happening in various ways. We had laws in 1942, at the time of just after Pearl Harbor. The Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment, the 5th Amendment, which says you can't be charged, you can't be incarcerated without being charged. 14th Amendment emphasizing that your citizenship is not affected by your national origin, your beliefs, creed, and so on. I had enough protection to have prevented something like total uprooting on the basis of ancestry. But it happened. And it could happen again in the same way. We have more protection now, but it's not going to be enough unless citizens insist on enforcing those things. So if the citizens look the other way and say, well, this is an emergency, anything could happen, and so it could happen again.
Thank you very much, Gordon. I'd like to make a comment that he is not only a scholar in sociology field with a great number of publications, but he's traveled in the Middle East, he's traveled in the Far East, he was a specialist with the World Bank, and if some of you want to pick up some of these flyers where there's much more about him, here is one person, I think, that is a product of the American dream that others dream about. And yet that American dream was shattered during World War II. Some of you know of a very famous Quaker college known as Haverford College out east. They will be awarding him an honorary degree also. I just found that out last night. I think Gordon looks different, like many of us from Asia who've chosen to make, me at least, America our home. But it takes people like you who look like the majority to make the system work. It takes people, many people. Gordon mentioned the Quakers supported him in the college, in the prison when he went to prison, and I heard this out at Utah last March. He had so many visitors, the prison people didn't know that, and I learned something else, that he was quite important in the prison. I really want to thank you, Gordon, for taking time to spend this time with us. I want to thank our audience for being with us, because that's what a forum is all about. And I hope if you want to hear him again, you will go to some of the other events at Hamlin and hear him. I think he shared with us personal as well as constitutional issues. And I want to thank you for the excellent job you've done. Thank you.